My husband forbade me from visiting his fishing cabin for 23 years, but after he collapsed from cardiac arrest, I finally drove there and discovered something that shattered everything I believed about my marriage. My name is Lorraine Bishop. I'm 47, living in Savannah, Georgia, one of those charming coastal towns where moss drapes the oaks and secrets hide beneath gracious smiles. Not long ago, everything I thought I understood about my existence crumbled completely. It began when my husband Marcus, everyone called him Mark, suffered a massive coronary. The emergency room physician delivered the news by telephone. He'd died alone, right after another solitary weekend at that riverside property. The one place he absolutely refused to let me see. For over 2 decades, that cottage remained forbidden territory, a locked vault wrapped in excuses and masculine rituals. I recall setting down the receiver and simply staring at nothing, unable to process what I'd just heard. Tears didn't come immediately. What filled me instead was hollowness rather than grief. Mark wasn't warm or loving or emotionally available. He operated through rigid expectations, household policies, and uncomfortable stretches of quiet. Our marriage had calcified into mechanical routine punctuated by his frequent disappearances. I'd trained myself to stop questioning, stop suggesting, stop existing too loudly. Now that death had claimed him, I couldn't determine whether I mourned the man or mourned the woman I'd surrendered to keep peace. Yes, I wept during the memorial service, but what churned beneath wasn't traditional sorrow. It resembled bewilderment tangled with unexpected liberation. Part of me carried shame for not feeling utterly destroyed, for not aching over someone who'd rendered me invisible across 2 decades. Mark controlled everything. He selected my wardrobe, criticized my speech patterns, and dictated when I could see my own siblings. His word was final, always. I existed merely as background scenery in whatever performance he was directing. Employment was never permitted. He insisted his income covered our needs sufficiently. But that arrangement stripped me of autonomy, voice, and agency. Whenever I proposed something new, he'd dismiss it with terse responses and barely concealed disdain masked by thin smiles. I diminished gradually, and now, confronting his permanent absence, I noticed an unfamiliar sound emerging within. Stillness. Not his imposed silence, but my own suppressed voice. The quietude I'd imprisoned for years. And suddenly, that silence demanded expression. Mark owned a riverside cabin deep in Georgia's lowlands, inherited from some distant relative before we'd even met. From our earliest days together, he established it as his exclusive sanctuary. Every weekend, he'd vanish there. Claimed he needed solitude, said he was catching base with buddies, insisted it was masculine territory. That spot isn't meant for wives, he'd say casually, as though excluding me was perfectly reasonable. He never once extended an invitation across our entire marriage. Initially it stung. Eventually, I surrendered. I transformed into the dutiful spouse who remained home, prepared his work clothes, and swallowed all curiosity. If I mentioned the property, he'd redirect conversations. If I expressed interest in visiting, he'd chuckle dismissively. Over time, that cabin symbolized everything concealed from me. What I couldn't have known was that it also held the key to everything I needed discovering about myself. Some doors stay locked not to protect you, but to imprison who you might become. The day Mark died, I recognized I'd eventually journey there. Not honoring him, but honoring myself. "7 days following the burial, I began sorting through his belongings. I wanted to empty drawers, conclude chapters, and purge our home of everything reeking of dominance and yesterday. Inside a manila envelope, I located the cabin paperwork, the title, electric bills, and maintenance receipts. Everything remained under his name exclusively, which surprised no one. But physically grasping that document felt like holding tangible evidence of my confinement. For the first moment ever, I genuinely considered selling it. I had zero desire to preserve anything connected to those lonely weekends, those silent Sunday suppers, those recycled justifications. That property embodied too much suffering. I planned to deliver the paperwork to my lawyer's office and initiate the listing immediately. But before proceeding, I experienced an overwhelming urge to witness it personally. Not from morbid fascination, but because I needed closing that chapter myself. I had no idea what awaited me, but I understood I was prepared to confront it. I departed early one Saturday morning, completely alone. I packed a small bag containing water, crackers, a journal, and a rusted key discovered buried in his nightstand. I wasn't certain it would work, but I clutched it like a belated permission slip. The route to the cabin was narrow, flanked by towering pines and heavy quiet. Each mile increased the pressure in my chest. When I arrived, I stopped before the weathered metal gate and killed the engine. My pulse hammered violently. No vehicles were parked outside, yet something felt peculiar. The mailbox contained recent correspondence. The lawn appeared freshly trimmed. The driveway showed signs of regular traffic. I approached cautiously, key extended, and inhaled deeply. I wasn't certain whether to unlock the gate or announce myself. I wasn't even convinced I belonged there. But something internal propelled me forward. This location no longer belonged to Mark. It was territory I finally possessed access to, and I intended to cross that boundary. When I stepped through the entrance, I stopped breathing. Clothing hung drying on the rear porch. A basket of children's toys sat beside the fireplace. The aroma of home-cooked food drifted through the air. This didn't resemble an abandoned or sealed-up residence. Quite opposite, it appeared lived in, maintained, vibrant with domestic rhythm. The floors gleamed spotlessly. The dining table displayed fresh-cut flowers in a ceramic vase. A small bicycle leaned against the window frame. Everything completely destabilized me. My initial assumption was that squatters had occupied the space, but that theory collapsed immediately. Nothing suggested invasion or disorder. Instead, there was organization, small domestic touches, genuine life. I remained frozen, afraid to advance further. Then footsteps echoed from the hallway, accompanied by a woman's casual voice calling softly. "Mark?" I couldn't move. I couldn't form words. That voice wasn't searching for me. Suddenly I comprehended that this cabin wasn't merely concealing secrets. This cabin was someone's home. I tapped gently, though my heartbeat threatened to crack my ribs. Within seconds, the door gradually opened, revealing a young woman, perhaps 29, her stomach prominently rounded with advanced pregnancy. Her expression mixed surprise with wariness, as though my presence defied explanation. Her eyes examined my face, my clothing, my trembling hands, searching for context. Before I could speak, she asked guardedly, "Can I help you?" In that instant, I recognized my presence there would demolish something fragile. I stated my name, then added steadily but calmly, I was Mark's wife. Her pupils expanded and her entire demeanor transformed. She retreated one step and widened the doorway, still studying me intensely. Without speaking, she motioned me inside and moved aside. The cabin's interior was even more welcoming than its exterior suggested. It breathed domesticity, intimacy, established patterns. I walked through like a trespasser. I settled onto the couch while she positioned herself in a facing armchair, still processing shock. The woman, who introduced herself as Destiny Carter, couldn't stop examining me with mingled confusion and distress. Her hands quivered slightly as she rested them protectively across her belly, seeking shelter from a reality she wasn't equipped to receive. When I confirmed Mark had passed away 7 days earlier, she pressed both palms against her mouth as tears spilled instantly. She explained she'd believed he was traveling for work, expected back the following evening. Nobody had contacted her. Nobody had informed her of anything. In her understanding, he still breathed somewhere out there. 2 women, 1 fabrication, stretched across years like barbed wire. She wept silently, staring blankly at the floor. I retrieved tissues from my handbag, and after several minutes of mutual wordlessness, she began explaining. She described him as gentle, said he couldn't stop watching her, and after repeated visits, he began pursuing her softly. According to her account, he was magnetic, polished, even affectionate. He discussed his supposed consulting career, his exhausting travel schedule, and relationship difficulties given his lifestyle. He never disclosed being married. He never revealed maintaining another existence in the city. As Destiny spoke, I sensed portions of myself quietly fracturing. Every detail, every lie Mark had delivered so effortlessly felt like invisible wounds reopening. She confessed their early relationship was sporadic, limited to occasional weekends, but eventually he proposed formalizing their commitment. They purchased furniture together, repainted rooms, discussed children. He promised her tomorrow, stability, family. And she believed him, precisely as I had decades prior. Identical words, identical optimism. 2 women, unified by deception sustained across years. Destiny retrieved a small container from the cabinet and presented it carefully. Inside were miniature baby shoes, a cloth rattle, and a white infant bodysuit decorated with moons. She explained they'd purchased these items together merely days before at a boutique downtown. He'd been enthusiastic. He'd discussed their child as though nothing else mattered. He'd promised to legally acknowledge the baby, search for bigger accommodations, and even mentioned wedding plans. Everything sounded so concrete, so meticulously arranged that goosebumps covered my arms. He'd executed this identical performance with me before. I observed her and witnessed my younger self reflected backward through time. Also pregnant once, also brimming with anticipation, also oblivious that this same man promising paradise was constructing devastation behind closed doors. Destiny was broken, though she hadn't yet grasped the complete devastation. She still needed comprehending that her narrative wasn't genuine either, that he simply reused identical scripts across different leading ladies. I withheld commentary. I just compressed my lips, studied the floorboards, and swallowed hard because deep within, I also carried guilt for never suspecting, for remaining silent so long, for not escaping earlier. Destiny activated her phone and displayed recent messages from Mark. They were tender, affectionate, discussing potential baby names and arrangements for his return from business travel. The final message was dated only 72 hours before his death. "Missing you both tremendously," it read, followed by a red heart symbol. She collapsed sobbing while reading aloud, as though still anticipating some clarification, some response, anything that would rationalize this reality that had just detonated before her. I permitted her tears. I possessed no comfort worth offering. She then showed me handwritten notes, cinema stubs, a small scrapbook documenting their romance. Everything Mark had denied sharing with me during recent years, he'd constructed with her. I even located an unfinished letter declaring his existence only became meaningful after meeting her. I experienced blended rage and vacancy. I couldn't determine whether to weep or explode, but neither happened. I just sat there examining remnants of a parallel storyline while internally everything gradually disintegrated. I remained wordless while destiny sobbed before me, gripping that phone as though it might resurrect him. I didn't know how providing consolation worked. I'd also spent countless nights crying over the identical man, albeit for different causes. What wounded me deepest wasn't the betrayal itself, but having existed so many years beside someone who never authentically revealed himself. I felt like my entire existence had been a meticulously staged production where I only performed the role he'd assigned. And now I was discovering I hadn't even been the sole performer in his theatrical deception. We were two women manipulated by the same leading actor. I didn't release a single tear during that encounter. I felt hollow, as though nothing breakable remained inside. I'd wept so extensively in private throughout the marriage that only skin toughened by repetition survived. Hearing Destiny tenderly recount her memories devastated me internally because many of those expressions sounded achingly familiar. I'd heard them too, long ago, delivered in the identical tone. It resembled witnessing my history mirrored in her present. Two narratives composed with the same ink of falsehood. When she finally composed herself, she looked at me with still damp eyes and said, "I had no idea he was married. I promise if I'd known, I never would have stayed." Her voice wavered, but what I recognized on her face wasn't culpability. It was pure disbelief. She was also victimized, though from a different vantage point. She apologized to me as though her ignorance constituted betrayal. I nodded silently. Nothing required forgiveness. Neither she nor I bore responsibility. The sole architect of this web was Mark. Destiny kept repeating the same phrase. I didn't know. I didn't know. I felt impulses to embrace her, despite so many conflicting emotions still separating us. I harbored no hatred toward her. Truthfully, I understood her more than I cared admitting. We shared more commonality than I ever could have imagined. We'd both loved the same man, believing he belonged exclusively to us, unaware we shared his fabrications. It was a bitter yet strangely freeing sensation because for the first time, I stopped feeling isolated in my suffering. We spent hours conversing without raised voices, without interrupting, just allowing words to emerge when ready. We listened to each other as though we'd required one another for years without awareness. Neither of us was hunting for blame between us, only answers, puzzle pieces that could fill gaps left by deception. Destiny shared her anxieties, her uncertainty about what came next now that everything had crumbled. I described my years of suppression, the sensation of never having truly experienced life. It was a painful conversation, but absolutely necessary. When I stood to depart, she accompanied me to the doorway. We studied each other wordlessly for several moments, and spontaneously, we embraced. It was an awkward, brief, but genuine gesture. Two women shattered by the same man discovering comfort in shared truth. I entered my car with a constricted chest and thoughts swirling endlessly. I didn't know what I intended to do next, but I was certain I no longer wanted to drag chains from a life that was forced upon me. It was time to author my own story. During the drive homeward, I couldn't stop thinking about Destiny. Her devastated face, her vulnerable body protecting the child of a man who hadn't been honest with either of us. She was alone, pregnant, lacking resources, without nearby family. I didn't know much about her, but something inside me churned powerfully. I couldn't turn away and pretend she didn't exist. Mark created this situation, not her. And although it caused pain, I felt human responsibility, not toward him, but toward her and that child. Sleep evaded me that night. I rose repeatedly, studied the ceiling, searched old containers, looking for something providing comfort. I didn't find it. What I discovered instead was fresh clarity. I couldn't remain passive while another woman paid consequences for lies she never initiated. I sensed that somehow helping her was also beginning helping myself. No longer as the betrayed spouse, but as a liberated woman capable of making decisions for the first time without fear or permission. I was finally starting to hear my own voice. The following weekend, I filled several bags with baby clothing I'd saved for my niece, essential groceries, and a couple of novels I thought she'd enjoy. I didn't know whether destiny would welcome me or comprehend what I was attempting, but something drove me to return. I wanted her knowing she wasn't abandoned, that not every connection in her life had to be marked by desertion. Arriving at the riverside cabin, I exited my vehicle slowly and knocked on the door, uncertain what to expect. She needed several seconds to answer. When she saw me, her eyes widened with surprise, as though she couldn't believe I'd actually returned. I smiled calmly and displayed the bags. I said nothing. Neither did she. We regarded each other in silence until she stepped aside, permitting entry. She received me with blended confusion and gratitude. The cabin was more organized than previously, but her gaze still belonged to a lost woman. I placed the bags on the table and told her she didn't need to decide anything that day. I simply came to be present. And I stayed. During lunch, we spoke little, but the atmosphere differed. Something softer existed between us, less strained. She inquired about my life, what my marriage had been like, and I answered honestly. I described how I'd learned remaining quiet avoided confrontation, how isolation had been my permanent companion. Destiny listened attentively with that particular silence only those who felt identical pain possess. I asked whether she'd considered what she'd do after the baby arrived. She looked downward, shook her head, and said she lacked strength thinking that far ahead. It was then I proposed helping her locate a small apartment in Savannah near my home. I told her it wasn't obligation, that I expected nothing in return, and that I was doing it because I understood her fear and her bewilderment. Initially, she didn't know what to say. She stared at me, eyes expanded, as though I was speaking foreign language. Then she asked quietly, "Why would you do that for me?" And I replied with honesty, "Because you're not responsible. Because I stood where you stand now, and because nobody reached toward me when I needed it most." A week later, I located a small but charming studio apartment in a peaceful Savannah neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it contained everything necessary. A bright bedroom, a functional kitchen, and a simple bathroom. I furnished it with just essentials, always considering Destiny's and the baby's comfort. I purchased sheer curtains, a soft area rug, and left a bassinet in the bedroom with diapers, blankets, and a stuffed animal that made me think of hope. When I called to tell her the apartment was ready, she was silent for several seconds. Then, her voice cracking, she said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." I helped her move using my car. It was a short journey, but loaded with emotion. She gazed out the window silently, clutching a backpack as though it was her only possession. Upon arrival, she opened the studio door and walked through the space without speaking. After several minutes, she turned to me with tears in her eyes and embraced me. It was a real embrace, requiring no explanation. In that instant, I understood that without planning, we were starting something new. Not a forced friendship, but an honest partnership between two wounded women who'd decided against staying silent anymore. It didn't take long for the first venomous comment arriving. It came from Patricia, Mark's sister, who called one afternoon just to say she was ashamed of me. "You're dishonoring your husband's legacy," she said coldly, as though I were a traitor. She spoke about family, about public perception, about the impropriety of befriending the other woman. I wasn't surprised. Patricia always prioritized appearances over truth. I replied simply, "Do what you need to do," and disconnected without remorse. This time, I wouldn't justify myself. For years, I'd remained silent to maintain peace, to avoid discomfort, to not bother anyone. But now I understood silence had only damaged me. I didn't have to explain my decisions to people who never knew what I'd experienced. Destiny wasn't my enemy, my rival, or my punishment. She was the consequence of a lie that I'd also unknowingly participated in. Helping her wasn't provocation. It was a way of breaking the cycle. And if that bothered others, they could learn to live with it, just as I'd learned living with their judgments. After settling Destiny comfortably, I made a firm decision to sell the riverside cabin. I never wanted setting foot there again. That location was saturated with secrets, lies, and silences far too heavy. It no longer belonged to me emotionally, even though the title said otherwise. I contacted a realtor, surrendered the keys, and signed documents without looking back. It resembled closing a door that had been injuring me for years without my awareness. And by closing it, I felt I could finally breathe. I didn't tell Destiny anything until the sale finalized. I didn't want her thinking I was doing it for her or because of what I'd discovered. I was doing it for myself because I needed releasing that burden. When I told her, she looked at me silently and said, "You've been braver than you realize." I didn't know how to respond, but her words remained with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt neither nostalgia nor anger, just a strange peace, as if I'd finally recovered a part of myself that I thought was lost. Slowly, Destiny and I began building a bond that transcended the circumstances that brought us together. We didn't communicate daily, but we were present for each other when most needed. I accompanied her to several ultrasound appointments, helped her with insurance documents, and went with her to collect a crib a neighbor had donated. She never requested anything, but accepted my help with that mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that I also knew intimately. Seeing her so young and so broken hurt me, not from pity, but from empathy. I'd had more years to develop calluses. She had not. One day, I found her crying at her apartment door because she couldn't manage the weight of her grocery bags. I didn't hesitate taking her keys and carrying everything upstairs without speaking. That gesture was like a crack that opened between us. And from then on, our relationship stopped being just occasional assistance and became true companionship. She would share her fears, and I understood them without requiring explanation. We began speaking to each other naturally without formalities, as though somehow life had united us, not just through suffering, but for a second chance. The day she went into labor, she called me at 6 o'clock in the morning. She was having consistent contractions and didn't know who else to call. I dressed quickly, grabbed the bag we'd packed together weeks earlier, and drove her to the hospital, my hands cold with anxiety. For hours, I stayed beside her, breathing with her, holding her hand, and calming her when fear overwhelmed her. I watched her break with pain and then compose herself with strength. And when the baby finally arrived, I felt something I hadn't expected. A profound tenderness, as though he were somehow part of me too. Destiny cried with emotion, and I embraced her, my heart swelling. The boy was beautiful, peaceful, with wide open eyes, as if he understood everything happening. She asked me to hold him, and as I did, something inside me released. He wasn't my grandson or my son, but this baby represented something new, something clean. He represented the end of a lie and the beginning of a different story. In that moment, I felt Mark no longer held any power over me. His greatest legacy wasn't the damage. It was the life I helped bring into the world. Several weeks later, I started therapy. I didn't do it because I thought I was ill, but because I wanted understanding why I'd permitted so much for so many years. Each session was like opening a sealed container inside myself. I uncovered wounds I'd normalized, surrenders I'd disguised as maturity, and silences I'd mistaken for peace. It wasn't easy confronting everything, but I sensed I had to if I truly wanted rebuilding myself. For the first time, I didn't want returning to being the same person. I wanted being me without masks, without fear, without guilt. I began writing in a notebook things I'd never dared saying aloud. I recalled moments I'd erased, looks that had wounded me, and words that still weighed on me. I cried some nights, but not from sadness, but from release. Healing hurt, but it hurt differently. It was a clean pain without guilt. The past no longer held me with the same force. I was learning to release it, not to forget it, but to not let it define me anymore. One day, my therapist recommended a women's support group that met every Thursday afternoon at the downtown community center. I hesitated to go. I felt out of place, as if it wasn't meant for me. But curiosity won out, and I ended up walking into a room filled with women of all ages, all with something broken inside. We shared stories, silences, tears, and most importantly, understanding. There, no one judged, no one interrupted, and no one competed for the worst wound. For the first time in a long time, I felt belonging. I started speaking slowly in short sentences, measuring every word. Initially, I feared nobody would understand what I'd lived through. But I soon discovered that many of them had gone through similar or worse situations. I wasn't crazy or overreacting or weak. I was just a woman who had survived as best she could in an environment that didn't allow her flourishing. Those afternoons became my refuge. I left feeling lighter, stronger, and clearer. And little by little, I began rebuilding myself from a new foundation. Honesty. One afternoon, after one of those meetings, I sat on a bench to drink a coffee I had purchased to go. I was tired but calm, enjoying the quiet. That's when Daniel Warren, a man with a measured voice and a serene gaze, who was also leaving the center, approached me. He asked if he could sit down, and we chatted for a while about the weather, literature, and how hard it was starting over. He told me he had been a widower for 3 years, that he was also in therapy, and that he still struggled sleeping at night. There was no romantic intent, just presence. For weeks, we encountered each other on that same bench. Sometimes we talked, other times, we just shared the silence. He didn't ask for my number, make any promises, or try forcing his way into my life. It was his calm demeanor that made me lower my guard. I wasn't searching for anyone, but I wasn't closing the door either. Next to him, I didn't feel like I had to explain or justify myself. He listened respectfully, without trying to fix me, without judging my past. And for me, that was already good love, the kind that doesn't burden you. With Daniel, I learned that love doesn't have to injure to be real, that a gentle touch can heal more than 1,000 empty words, and that everyday respect is worth more than grand promises. He didn't try to rescue me, replace what I'd lost, or occupy a space that didn't belong to him. He simply stayed with patience, with tenderness, with that way of being that demands nothing. He supported me through my doubts and encouraged me to trust without pressure. And gradually I began to open my world to him. Not out of need, but out of choice. There were no fireworks or grand gestures, but there were looks that said everything. Shared coffees and quiet walks in the park. It was a love that didn't come to fill voids, but to walk alongside me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing myself in someone else. I kept attending therapy. I kept building myself. But now, I did it accompanied. Daniel reminded me that the past doesn't define what I deserve and that after the chaos there can also be calm, a calm that doesn't numb but embraces. And that was new to me. When Daniel proposed marriage, he didn't do it on bended knee or with prepared speeches. It was a regular afternoon while we were raking leaves in the backyard. He looked at me tenderly and said, "We could make this something more permanent if you want." I didn't answer instantly. I just smiled because deep down I already knew. We organized a simple ceremony in a small backyard garden surrounded by only a few people, but all of them important. There was no loud music or expensive dresses, just truth, white flowers, and a silent promise to care for each other without causing harm. Destiny and her son were there, seated in the front row as part of my new story. When I saw her with a child in her arms, I felt the circle close. This baby, born from a lie, was now growing up surrounded by affection, respect, and genuine presence. Daniel took Destiny's hand at the end of the ceremony and thanked her for being there. I watched him in silence, moved, knowing that not all men resembled Mark. That wedding wasn't a fairy tale conclusion. It was a conscious beginning without ghosts, without masks. Love didn't heal my wounds, but it helped me not bleeding alone, and that was more than enough for me. In time, we had 2 more children, a girl with a strong personality and a sweet, observant boy. Watching them grow up in an environment where love wasn't conditional on fear was my greatest accomplishment. I wasn't seeking perfection, just calm, balance, and truth. Destiny remained a presence in our lives. She lived just a few blocks away, and we saw each other frequently. Our children played together, growing up like cousins without shared surnames, but with bonds stronger than blood. I no longer lived with that constant anxiety of needing to please or the need justifying every decision. I had learned choosing without fear. Sometimes when I saw them running through the living room or laughing loudly in the yard, I thought about everything it had cost me getting there. It wasn't an easy path or a quick one or a painless one. But it was mine. Every step I took, even the clumsy ones, moved me further away from a life imposed on me and closer to a life I had chosen. I was no longer the woman who kept silent, avoiding trouble. Now I was a mother, a partner, a friend, the owner of my own narrative. And even though I carried scars, I was no longer ashamed of them. They were the map of everything I had survived. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I think about Mark, not with anger or nostalgia, but with a cold distance that no longer hurts. He was part of my life, yes, but he doesn't define it. He lied to me. He lied to us. And he left a trail of pain that took years to disappear. But he also inadvertently pushed me toward a freedom I never would have imagined. Forgiving him didn't mean justifying what he did, but letting go of what I no longer wanted carrying. It was my way of breaking free from that shadow and walking toward my own light. Now I know what it is living without fear, without a disguise, without the need fitting into someone else's mold. My house smells of fresh baked bread, open books, and sincere laughter. I don't need grand things feeling whole, just peace. I've stopped looking for approval in the eyes of others because I learned recognizing myself in the mirror. This is me, Lorraine, the woman who was invisible for years and now shines without permission. And if I've learned anything throughout this journey, it's that living is worth it. Even if it hurts at first, even if it costs you, even if you have to start over from zero. If this story touched you, please hit that like button for Winds of Thought and share your thoughts below. Did you enjoy my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you appreciated this story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.